Portman co-authored the bill that was signed into law by the president in April, and he's committed to stopping sex trafficking and helping victims get justice by being able to sue websites that knowingly allow trafficking. Senator, thank you for joining me. This has been a story that you and I have been on for a long time.
We have. I appreciate your following.
You are not a guy who takes the First Amendment lightly. This is not an unexpected challenge, because there are a lot of people who say Section 230 and this Communications Decency Act and the Constitution allow people to be publishers of things and not be responsible for the content. That's sort of what you spent all this time developing this bill to sort of deal with. So tell me what your reaction is to this lawsuit.
Well, first, I was pleased with the first decision by Judge Leon. As you know, in the D.C. District Court, he did not grant them the relief they were looking for, but he did, say that there will continue to be a discussion of this. So we'll see. But my view is that we narrowly targeted the bill on knowingly trafficking women and children online, and that certainly is narrowly targeted, and it's not constitutionally protected speech. If you were to do the same thing outside of the internet context, of course, it would be a violation of federal law, and we actually used the federal law standard on purpose to ensure it was properly narrowed. In other words, not relying on state statutes that there might be 50 different standards. So I think we did it right, Allie. That's how we got a vote in the Senate of 97-2. You mentioned the tech communities are funding this effort. Gosh, I wish the tech communities would come on board and help us to fight trafficking rather than to fight this lawsuit.
Well, their fear, and I want you to address this as a guy who is a big defender of the First Amendment, their view is this is a slippery slope. Once you start regulating this, and we've studied this, and I don't think it's a slippery slope because, as you said, it is very narrow. It's about trafficking people who do not voluntarily want to be involved in sex work or have been coerced into it. But they feel it's a slippery slope. Once you have the government getting involved, saying what can and can't be done on the internet, before you know it, bad things are going to happen.
Yeah, and look, I get that. We understood it. That's why we did narrowly target this. And we went through lots of iterations and different language, and most of the tech community came on board in the end because we were able to work with them to properly narrow it, to ensure that there was, in fact, a good Samaritan provision that continued in the law, so that if a company was editing its own website, they wouldn't inadvertently fall into this trap. So we did a number of things to ensure that it was, a knowing standard, that there's a good Samaritan exception to it, that we are focused on the trafficking standard that's already been established by federal law. I think this is a mistake for the tech companies to use this as their example. And frankly, I think there are a lot of Americans out there, including some of whom are elected to office, who are going to react negatively to this, in the sense that, are you kidding me? You actually think it's constitutionally protected speech to be able to sell an underage girl online? We've heard from too many victims and too many survivors, as I have all through the state of Ohio, but my colleagues now have from around the country, who tell us that they are really happy that finally Congress stood up and took away what was effectively an immunity for selling women and children online.
Right, because they were hiding behind this. They were hiding behind this 1996 law, which really didn't foresee things like Backpage, and Backpage wouldn't back down until this law came into place.
You're absolutely right. And you mentioned the Justice Department going after Backpage. That's good. I'm glad they have. But for 14 years, they didn't. And so, I think it was necessary to see this change in law. It does two things. One, you mentioned, it allows the victims to get their day in court. That to me is just fairness. Yeah. But second, it does allow the local and state prosecutors to proceed on these cases. And again, I'm glad the Department of Justice is going after Backpage now. It took them 14 years to do it. It's much more likely you're going to see state prosecutors in particular take up these cases and, take up the cause of the women and the children and the families who are so negatively impacted by trafficking.
Senator, I just want to change gears to a couple of things we're dealing with today, including tariffs and the announcement from the White House and Secretary Perdue of money that's going to farmers to compensate for the countervailing tariffs that have been put on. You got a lot of farmers, a lot of agriculture workers in your state. Are you worried that that we're getting to some very dangerous places in this trade war?
Well, yeah. I mean, first of all, I think it is an acknowledgement by the administration that there is a problem here. In other words, some had been saying, well, it's not a big deal. It's a small part of overall trade. But it is impacting certain sectors significantly, and one is agriculture. In Ohio, in particular, we're a big soybean state, probably number 7 in the country on soybeans. Our biggest market is China. So the increase in tariffs on soybeans is a big deal to our farmers in Ohio. I will say, having talked to a bunch of soybean farmers over the weekend, I got the same refrain, which I'm sure you've heard a lot, which is we want trade, not aid. We want open markets. We want to be able to sell our product. We don't want to be dependent on government for, a handout, as they call it. So I don't think this will be very popular among the rank and file farmers, although, $12 billion is a lot of money.
Sure.
Second, I do think there are other sectors of the economy that are also responding and saying, well, how about us? So, whether it's workers in the manufacturing sector, or as someone from Alaska just told me, how about my fishermen? Everybody's getting hit with different kinds of tariffs right now. And so there will be a number of people who will step up and say, well, what do I get for this trade policy? So I do think it's a concern. China has not been playing by the rules. I think, Ali, I've also talked about this issue over the years, and there's no question about that. We do need to put pressure on them, and we need to change the dynamic, but we have to be careful as to how we do it.
It would be good to be a little more targeted on China, however. Speaking about targeted, you're on the Committee on Foreign Relations. The Iran thing has suddenly gotten very, very hot. Tell me your thoughts.
Well, I don't know that it's gotten any hotter than it's been. I think we need to cool the tensions here. I don't think that the Iran agreement was a good agreement for us or for the region, and I think you've seen this over the past couple of years with Iran continuing to exert its influence, not just in Syria, but well beyond, as we've seen in Yemen and elsewhere. So I do think there is an issue here. I will say that my information is that they are no longer harassing our ships, in the Gulf. So I think we already have a situation where we've kind of told them, we're going to react more aggressively now, which is not a bad thing. But I don't agree that this is diplomacy by tweet is not my preference. It's certainly not how I would do it.
Senator, good to see you. Thank you again for joining us on this topic.
Thanks for following the trafficking stuff too, Ali. I really appreciate that.
Thanks. Senator Rob Portman.